Chapter 16. His grandpap had told him stories of the war, how you could feel the wind of a bullet as it nearly missed. He hadn't believed the stories until today. As he, Eli, Arnold, Mr. Harmon, and his pa made their way to town, they had been set upon twice by two small groups of the cowboys they'd let go 2 weeks before. The malcontents had hidden in the ditches to catch the group as they rode by, and it was only the height that sitting on a horse afforded that allowed them to see their attackers in time. The first group had been 8 men, the second 5. They were almost to town now, and he still had no idea where Stan might be holding Isabel, and none of the men they'd gathered would talk. His pa and Mr. Harmon took the group of tied vigilantes to the sheriff, and he and his brothers waited. They needed to decide their next step, or Conrad would just start riding. He had to find Isabel, and Lord help Stan if he had hurt her. Arnold searched the area, his head constantly swiveling and eyes alert. "He didn't plan for you to be able to read the note, right, Conrad?" Conrad's jaw flexed. He didn't like that it was common knowledge in the family that he had lacked the skill for longer than he should have. "Right. Well, he's probably holding her somewhere in town, at least until he hears that you've been dispatched. There are only 2 empty buildings available right now, the school and the place there on the main street." Arnold was more than likely correct. Stan couldn't have kept her at his place. He stayed at the boarding house after his family had lost all their holdings a few years before. If he was keeping her in case Conrad had made it through the traps Stan had left, he'd need her safe, at least for a short time, to trade. "So, my guess would be the school. It's close enough to town that he can get away and far enough out that no one will bother to look there. How do we get to it without notice?" Eli slipped his red bandana over his face and pulled his revolver. "We make a little noise, a little confusion, and maybe a little mess." He laughed as he spurred his mount toward the distant school. Arnold glanced at Conrad. "Crazy Eli. You have any idea what he's got planned?" Conrad shrugged. "If I had to guess, it'll involve getting shot at. At least we know Stan's not a good shot." He spurred his own horse after his brother. Eli hollered, "Under fire! Open up!" as he leaned over the horse's neck and out of Stan's line of sight. Stan slammed the door open, and Conrad gripped the reins to keep from drawing and taking him out on the spot. Isabel was somewhere inside that school, and a bullet was indiscriminate. Stan's eyes turned to great white saucers as he realized his mistake, and he ran to get out of the way of Eli and his racing horse. Eli slapped Desperado's flank with the reins, and he ran right up the steps into the school, skidding as he slid through the double doors. Conrad spurred his horse to follow, and Arnold was on his tail. The blast of 2 shots and screams from the school urged Conrad even faster, along with his heart. He slid off his mount and raced into the building. Eli's horse was against the wall, and Eli knelt over someone at the front of the room. Conrad drew, just in case there was anyone else, and searched all over for Isabel, frantic to find her. Isabel pushed from behind Eli's horse with her shoulder. Her hands were bound behind her, and her hair was loose from its braid, but she was there, safe. He had found her. Arnold stopped in his tracks as he stared at the teacher cowering on the floor. He tentatively helped the woman up, then got the shock of his life as the woman clung to him, sobbing. Isabel turned away from Conrad so he could cut the rope from around her wrists. He fumbled as he untied her, just wanting her in his arms. "Is there anyone besides the teacher here we need to worry about?" He had to focus, complete the task. Then he could forget about everything but his Isabel. He'd come so close to losing her. Her cold hands trembled under his fingers. She shook her head, and the moment her hands were free, she whipped around and wrapped her arms around him. He never wanted another day to go by where he didn't feel her pressed against him. She belonged right there in his arms. Isabel was the woman the Lord had created just for him, and no one would ever take her from him again. He brushed the soft, loose strands of hair out of her face and cradled her cheeks in his palms. "I've never been more worried in all my life." She nodded into his hands, her eyes tightly closed, and she clung to him. He let go of her face and stroked her back, hoping to calm her. "I met your pa. He's worried about you. We'll need to go back and let him know that you're safe. Your ma, too." He held his breath and prayed there would be no lasting harm to Isabel. He'd never wanted to do harm to a man more than he wanted to harm Stan, with maybe the exception of Isabel's late husband. It didn't matter that he had tried to hurt Conrad, but once he had hurt Isabel, that he couldn't abide. Eli glanced at him over his shoulder and shook his head, his face solemn. Stan was dead. Eli had done the job, and now he'd have to deal with the aftermath. Even if a man was aiming to kill, it was still never easy to pull the trigger. Conrad turned Isabel around and led her out of the building. She didn't need to see Stan anymore. The sheriff would soon be there and would probably wonder why he wasn't asked to join the posse. But the work was now done, with the other men in custody and the man in charge dead on the schoolhouse floor. There was no better place for Isabel than at home, but she would need to speak to the sheriff first. She had been the one kidnapped, and he'd have to testify that Stan had shot at him, though he still wasn't sure if Stan had ever pulled the trigger. He had asked one of his men to do it the first time. He may have hired it done the second time as well. If none of the men they'd captured never spoke a word about it, they would probably never know. The barber in Belle Fourche also happened to be the undertaker, and he was soon brought in to take care of Stan. Conrad kept Isabel far from the sight. Though many people had become calloused to the sight of death, especially in the West, he didn't want her to have any other images from this day. She would have enough. Her wrists were red and swollen from the rope, and a gash across her face told him more than he wanted to know about her ordeal. After the sheriff had taken her aside to ask her what she knew, they were allowed to leave. Conrad helped her mount Talon, and then slid into the saddle behind her, cradling her close to his chest. Leaving her that night would be more difficult than anything he'd ever done.